So this is Sam Reynolds, and I am a ISPF architect as well as an architect on ZOS Communication Server. Today's topic, as you see on the screen, is ISPF recent and coming enhancements. You'll notice also that there is a PDF available of this chart deck on SlideShare. That's a fairly long URL to type in, but if you'll just go to slideshare.net/ZOSComServer, it'll probably be the very first thing that pops up. If not, there's a little area on the right side of the page where you can choose amongst several presentations, and this will be one of those. So if you want a PDF, you can download it from there. Getting on into the agenda here, we're going to have a couple brief notes up front, and then we're going to go into a set of topical areas that we're going to talk about related to ISPF. The first 6 of those that you see, beginning with dataset list enhancements and going down through multiple screens, are all things that you should be able to do today, at least if you're on V2R1. Probably somewhere around the neighborhood of half of the things that we'll talk about are available as new features in V2R1. The rest of the items go back before that. There's things on R13 and items that go back as far as even Release 8. So we'll identify as we go what features are from what release, and you'll know whether or not they're available to you. The last topic we'll go into will be the enhancements that are part of ZOS V2R2. One topic I want to get into before we go to the main body of the presentation is RFE. I think most of you are familiar with request for enhancements now, so I don't want to belabor the point too much, but I just want to remind you that it's out there and it applies to ISPF just as it applies to Communication Server. There's the link on your screen to get there. Many of you probably have already been there before to open requirements. ISPF right now, unfortunately, has requirements under 2 different brands. One under WebSphere and also under servers and system software. We would prefer that if you submit new requirements that you choose the brand servers and system software and then ISPF under that. We'll see it either way, and hopefully one day we'll get these all merged together. But right now, if you have a choice, put them there. This is a good time to be looking at ISPF RFEs, either looking at existing ones and voting for the ones you think are important, or opening any new ones if there's things that you feel are important that ISPF address, because we are at the point where we need to be planning the next release, and so we're looking through the RFEs and beginning to prioritize potential content for that release. So this is a good time to be getting your votes in if there's ISPF requirements you would be interested in. Having said that, let's get into the material. We're going to start with a category of enhancements related to the dataset list. And the first thing we'll talk about is the ability to display the total tracks. So if you go to 3.4, the dataset list utility, if you're in either the space or the total view, there's an option that you can choose over on the lower right side of the panel called Display Total Tracks. And if you select that, when we pull up the dataset list, we will add a line across the top that tells you the total number of tracks being consumed by all the datasets on the list. You can exclude a few of them if you want to, and it'll show you the number of tracks used by the non-excluded ones as well as the total. So this is basically a good tool to have if you're trying to determine the total space requirements for a given set of datasets. If what you specify in the DS name level field is going to be something that's going to pull up a lot of datasets, you may see a progress window pop up and move across while we're calculating the number of total tracks, so just be aware of that. 1.10 brought the ability to do block line commands. I suspect many of you have used these. For your dataset list, you can take a block of files and do a / in front of the first one, followed by a command, and then a / is an ending delimiter on the last line of the set of files, and the command will be executed against every file in that block. You can use TSO commands, clist, regexec, all can be executed as block commands. So this is just a time-saving feature. Sometimes you may have a large group of jobs that you're submitting at once, or a large number of files you're operating against in some manner. One little kind of interesting tidbit here is that let's consider a use case where you had maybe 100 files that you wanted to execute one command against. So that would be a great opportunity here. But what if you had the problem that somewhere in the middle of that list of 100 files, there were 1 or 2 here or there that you didn't want to include. So you want to do all but a handful. Well, you could exclude those files. You can type an X by the 1 or 2 that you don't want to be included, have them excluded, and then you can submit the block command that way and have it apply to everything but the excluded files. So that's a way to get a block of this many files except for these 1 or 2 here or there. The catch on that is laid out in the last bullet on this chart. Is there is an option. If you go to the options menu at the top of the dataset list there, the very first under there will be dataset list settings. If you choose that, there's a flag that you can set called execute block commands for excluded datasets, and that very well may be already selected for you. You'll want to deselect it if you would like to be able to exclude datasets from the block. So just keep that in mind. It's a neat little trick to have in your arsenal. 1.13 added an allocate line command, which gives you the ability to allocate a new data set that you say is going to be just like that one that I already have at a particular point. So you can enter the AL line command beside a data set that's currently in your data set list and specify a name, and that will cause us to go out and allocate a new one with the exact same attributes as the one that already exists. Or you have the option of actually making some changes to those attributes. So if you look at the example at the bottom of the screen, you see a data set called demo.load, and over to the right I type AL, or in the right picture I type AL beside it, and then I specify a new name, demo.load.new, for a new data set that I want created that's almost like demo.load. Now when I do that, I get the allocate target dataset panel that pops up, and it basically is asking the simple question: do you want to allocate the data set to be exactly like the one you typed it beside, demo.load, or do you want to slightly change the attributes? In this case of this picture here, I chose option 2, which pulls up the allocate new data set panel and allows me to tweak the attributes a little bit. So I have an easy way to create a data set that exactly matches the attributes of an existing one, or that just is slightly different. And this is an easier way than going through 3.2 to allocate the data set. Okay, and I think the last one in this particular section is the ability to put a Unix path name in the DS name level field under 3.4 and get a Unix directory list from there. So many of you are probably familiar with 3.17, the Unix directory list utility, where you can go in and put Unix path names. 2.1 just added the capability to be able to get to a Unix directory from 3.4. So in the example here, I've typed /etc in the DS name level field, and it takes me into the Unix directory list for /etc, as you see right there. Okay, so that was a number of enhancements related to dataset list processing. Now let's look at some enhancements related to processing the member list and also some scroll-related enhancements. Okay, as I said, we have some things here that go back a little ways, and here's one that goes all the way back to 1.8, and that's the filter command. So this is gives me a way when I'm in a member list and there's a lot of members and I want to be able to reduce that down to some that fit a few characteristics. I can use the filter command to filter on any given column name, and either by date or user ID or whatever the case may be. There's two ways to issue the command. You can just type the word filter and we'll pull up a panel that you can fill in. And if you've never used it before, that's a good way to get started and to see how it works. Once you've done this a time or two, it's actually probably simpler just to type the command on the command line, specifying the column you want to filter against, the operation, and the value you want to compare against. But at the bottom of the screen, you see on the left what you would get if you typed the word filter without any other specification. You get that panel, and it gives you a way to choose which field you want to compare against, what operation you want equal, less than, whatever the case may be, and a value you want to compare for. So in the case of the example on this screen, I'm comparing user ID and saying I want to find members where it's equal the value GXM. And over on the right, you see the output of that filter command. It's narrowed what was a member list of, say, 40 or so members down to 2 lines, so I can quickly drill down on the one thing I'm interested in. On the next screen, we'll look at an example of not using the panel, but just using the easy syntax of the command itself. In the command line, we say filter size greater than 50. So I want to see all members in my list that are have a size greater than 50. So very straightforward syntax, and it trims it down to this. Here are the 5 members I have out of the however many it was that fit that qualification. Now that I've done that, if I want to, I could also then sort them. So I type sort size, so sort in any column name, but in this case I want to sort the size column, and I end up with a descending order from largest to smallest size. And in fact, I don't show it here, but you could follow the sort size with either an A or a D for ascending or descending, so you can get whichever operation you'd like there. So again, just a good way for large member lists to be able to drill down on the particular items you might be interested in. Filter command, we also had an enhancement around the same time frame in the search for command that uses that built-in filter function. So here in the case, I've entered search for and pulled up the search for panel, and I've said I want to search through a bunch of members looking for the word device. And if I do that, this is my updated member list. Here's all my members, and the ones that had the word device in it, I have this asterisk found indication by alongside them. So you may not know it, but when you see something like that, you can also issue the sort command and sort on the prompt field. So by saying sort prompt, you would be able to move all the ones that had something actually found toward the top where they're in one place, which is convenient, and that helps. But you can do it a little bit easier way. If you go back to the search for panel, there's an option on the lower right called filter list, and if you select that, then we'll do that sorting for you. We'll actually just show only the items that have been found. They'll all be grouped together, and the others will be omitted from the output. So this is just a nice way to, again, reduce the results that you're looking at. Okay, something a little bit different here. It was an enhancement in 2.1 to allow member counts greater than 99,999. So prior to this, if you were looking at a member list and there were more than 99,999 members, you didn't get an accurate output. The left characters would have been truncated. So as of 2.1, that field has been expanded to 7 digits, and now you can accurately see what's there. We also, in the same release, 2.1, support scroll amounts up to 9,999,999. Again, before this was limited as well. So as you see in the example there, now I can type a very large amount when I do my up or down commands, a large scrolling amount. Note that the scroll field on the right where it says CSR in this case, it sometimes says page or half, that is still limited to 99.99. It's still a 4-character field, so you don't have the larger scroll amounts there. It's also worth noting that the maximum scroll value, to fully support that has to be set in the ISPF configuration utility. So whoever maintains your configuration will need to make that update. Okay, let's move on to a third area on the agenda called edit enhancements. So this is our enhancements into the ISPF editor. And the first thing we'll look at is an edit line command to show lines in hex. So if you're in the editor here, over on the command prefix area, you can type HX, and we will display that line in a hexadecimal as well as the character view. Or you can just type HXX at the beginning and end lines and get a whole block of lines displayed in hexadecimal format. And these are toggles. So in this case, you see on the screen, I've typed HXX on one line, a couple lines further down, I've typed HXX again, and that entire block is now displayed with hexadecimal as well as the original character representation. I could then type HXX again in the same fields and turn the hexadecimal display off for those lines. Okay, 2.1 brought a small enhancement to the compare command to allow the addition of the specification of the volsair through a keyword to allow the comparison against data sets that have not been cataloged. So today, if we were to do a compare operation like you see on the screen here, where I compare against a member, and that member I'm comparing against has not been cataloged, you could get an error message like you see at the top right of this display, data set not cataloged. So 2.1 adds an operand vol where you specify the volsair, and now that allows us to actually complete the comparison. Now, a couple things to note on here. If you look at the compare command as I typed it, note the X at the end, so that's where you say that I want to exclude lines that match other than just a few around the point of exclusion for a little bit of perspective on what the difference is. Also notice that when I typed this command in, I was just about out of space on the command line. It looks like there might have been maybe 1 character left. So if my member dataset name, any of that had been a little bit longer, I would appear to be out of luck. So another enhancement in 2.1 was the enhancement of the compare settings panel to give me a way to handle longer names and longer compare commands. So if you type just the word compare without any operands, you'll pull up the panel that you see on this screen here. And the big area that's circled down there is where you put all the stuff that formerly would have been on the command line. So you can put a much longer data set and member name there. You would put a slash by exclude to do the same thing as the X I had on the previous chart. There's a field for the volume that we just added and so forth. So this gives you a way, if you have a longer data set name and member name, to handle it through the compare panel. Also, this is the place where you would set the amount of context you want to keep around your points of exclusion. On here it shows there being 5 lines displayed around every exclusion point, but you could adjust that depending on how much perspective you'd like. Okay, the next chart is another change in 2.1. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, there were a lot of things in 2.1, and so many of the things we'll talk about today do fall into that release. And that was an enhancement to allow regular expressions on the find, change, and seek commands. Now, some people get excited about regular expressions, some don't. If you come from the Unix world, you'll probably find these to be indispensable. Maybe not as much if you're an old ZOS guy like me, but here's the syntax on the screen. Find, the letter R, then the delimiter, and then a regular expression. And you now can search, while you're editing, search through a file based on the regular expression. And so in this example you see on the screen, I'm saying I want to find something that starts with L, followed by either an A or an I, then followed by N and E. And when I do my search, it finds the word lane. It would have also found line and so forth. Here's a chart that shows the symbols that we support for regular expressions. Pretty much the standard you would see in any implementation of regular expressions. A period matches any one character, an asterisk matches 0 or more instances of character, plus matches 1 or more instances. A string of letters within brackets matches any one character that's in that string, and so forth. If you've used regular expressions before, this should be a very familiar syntax. Another thing in 2.1 was an expandable command field. So if you're in the editor and you go up to type a command on the command line, you may find sometimes you run out of room, just as we saw with that compare command earlier. In 2.1, we use the zexpand command window to have a pop-up window with an input field expanded to a length of 255 characters. And PF4 is set to invoke zexpand in the ISPF supplied edit key list. So in the example at the bottom of the screen, you see a change command being issued, and it's got a very long source and starts a very long destination. And we get to a certain point, we realize, wait, this will fit on the command line. If I hit PF4 at that point, it will open up this zexpand window, which gives me up to 255 characters to type. And notice that it takes what I've already typed to that point and copies it over into the zexpand window, so I can just complete whatever I was trying to type and go from there. And one more edit enhancement is the ability to highlight JCL lowercase characters in reverse video. So if you're editing JCL jobs, you know your data set names need to be in all uppercase, but you might accidentally occasionally, when you're in a little bit of a hurry, overtype something in lowercase. If you've turned on highlight JCL, those lowercase characters in your jobs are going to be in this ugly pink reverse video, which should kind of jump right off the screen at you and help you catch that before you submit it and get some kind of failure. Okay, let's move into PDSE version 2 member generation support. So PDSE version 2 member generation support was added via APAR by DFSMS shortly after V2R1 shipped. So there's an APAR number at the top of your screen. It's a DFSMS APAR that provides it. There were also a couple of APARs required for the support for that in ISPF. From DFSMS perspective, there are some configuration you do, including setting a max gens limit, which is the maximum number of generations you want your installation to support. ISPF itself does provide the ability to work with previous generations of a member, and there's a list of bullets there that tells you what that support is available. First of all, under the dataset allocation 3.2 panels, you have the ability to specify the maximum generations that you want for a particular dataset you're creating. Whenever you use the info to display the information about a dataset, you can see the maximum number of generations that data set was allocated with. We do give you the ability to choose a generation that you want to browse or edit, including the previous generation or the base generation. We have support for something called new gen or no gen on the save command, and I'll have a chart separately to discuss that later. And there's limited support on our ISPF services, DSInfo, edit, view, browse, LMD list. Another thing to point out here is that Dataset Commander, which is a separate product that provides additional ISPF type capabilities, does have very robust support for managing member generation. So if you would like a little more than what you're going to see here from a member generations handling standpoint, you might want to take a look at the capabilities provided by Dataset Commander. Okay, the next chart talks about the way you would address generations. There's two ways, either via relative addressing or absolute addressing. And I prefer relative addressing. Absolute says that, as always, the current generation is generation 0, and generation 1 is the oldest, with the numbers going up from 0. Generation 2 is the second oldest, generation 3 is the third oldest, and all the way up to 0 in this case. The left side, relative generations, again, I find to be a little more intuitive. You start with the generation 0 being the base generation, minus 1 is the previous generation, minus 2 is 2 back, minus 3 is 3 back, and in the case of this picture, the oldest. So when we look at an example in a minute, we're going to work from relative generations because I find that to be easier to deal with. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we have this ability to do something called save new gen and no gen. With save new gen, you can edit any generation and save it and have it become the new base generation, generation 0. So why would you want to do this? I mean, picture a use case where you edited maybe a programming file and you saved it, and you made some changes the next day and you saved it, and you made some changes the next day and you saved it. Now you've got this trail of older versions and the current one, and you decide at this point in time that, man, I've really messed up the current version. The one from yesterday I think might still be a little bit off too. I want to drop back to one 2 days ago, which was at a more stable point from my perspective. Well, you could go in, edit that generation, save it as a new generation, and it is now your new base generation. So that's what save new gen gives you. The second bullet talks about the save no gen option. This is something you would do against the base generation. Let's say you've got several generations and you want to make a change to the base generation. It's fairly trivial, fairly minor. You just want to make a little tweak, and you don't see the need to have your set of generations modified in their entirety, all pushed down one. You just want to make this one little change. You can do a save no gen, and we'll update the base generation but not create any new generations. And we're going to look at an example of some of this in a minute. You can rename a file like you always could. The one thing to be aware of here is when you do the rename, we will delete all generations except the base generation. So you'll be starting kind of clean from that point. There's a delete command. Copy with generations is not supported. If you do a copy of a data set, we will allow the copy, but the generations won't go with it. You'll be copying the base generation into a new file, and that will be the extent of it. Okay, the next chart just shows you some pictures of some of the panels that are involved in using this. If you go to allocate a new data set, you're at 3.2. First of all, it has to be a data set type of library. We're talking about PDSE version 2 member generation, so the data set version has to be 2, and the number of generations is however many generations you want to support. In this example here, I typed 3. If you're looking at a data set and you type I beside it from the DS list, you want to get the information. You see there that it was data set version was 2, and again you see the number of generations that are allocated that it's allowed to have really. If you edit a generation, if you look at the lower left of the screen, you have to use the prompt field to specify which generation you want to see. So you put a slash under the word prompt, and then that pulls up a panel where you can specify the generation you want to edit. And the same is true for browse. So on here you see we're editing this demo.test.pdse gens member N5, and we're saying we want to edit generation -1. Okay, I want to talk a little bit how the no gen, new gen type operations work. So let's look at an example of a file that's gone through several generations. So originally, this simple file just said the cat. At some point I edited it to say the cat and the hat and saved it. At some point I edited it again and said the cat and the hat comes back. So now at this point that cat in the hat comes back is my base generation. That's generation 0. The cat in the hat is -1 generation. And my oldest, my original one, has been pushed all the way down to -2. It still just says the cat. Now let's say we want to revert back to generation -2 with a little change. So I can actually edit generation -2, and I'm going to change the cat to my cat. I'm going to do a save new gen. So I'm saying I want to edit a previous generation and make that be my new base generation. So when I do that, the change I made to generation -2 now becomes generation 0, and the other two, generation 0 and -1, get pushed down 1, as you see in the picture. Okay, so kind of keep in your mind what that picture looks like with my cat, the cat in the hat comes back, and the cat in the hat. And let's do an edit again. Let's now edit the base generation, changing my cat to my cat in the hat. We're going to save no gen. So remember, that says we want to save the base generation but not push anything down in the previous generations. So my cat in the hat becomes the new base generation, and the other two are unchanged from what you would have seen on the previous chart. So that kind of just gives you a little flavor of what new gen and no gen are used for and how you use them. Now, if I decided at this point that I want to rename this file, so I'll rename it. It was called Seuss. I'm going to rename it to New Seuss. I can do that. But after I did that, on my screen here, I went to Browse the -1 generation. Notice what I get at the top right of the screen, invalid gen parameter. That's because when I renamed it, I lost everything but the base generation. The others have been destroyed. Okay, let's move on then to the next section, which is Unix directory list. If you see on this chart, there are a lot of places today that you can put Unix path names in. There's a lot of function in ISPF related to Unix file processing, and we'll talk about that as we go through this section. Most of the bullets on this chart, with the exception of 1 or 2, I'm going to elaborate on the coming chart, so we'll go through this one kind of quickly. Clearly, the first one is very important. 3.17 is the Unix directory list utility. There has been a fair amount there for some period of time. There is more that's added in 2.2. We'll see that toward the end of the presentation. You can enter a Unix path name in the other name field under ISPF options 1 and 2, the view and edit panels. So that was added in 1.2. There is a udlist command that was added in 1.10 that could be entered from any command field. And lowercase support, path name support was added for that in 2.1. So basically it says that whenever I'm on a command field, wherever I may be, I can type udlist and say for this path name and immediately go to a directory list. Just a little bit quicker than going through 3.17. We mentioned at the beginning of the dataset list enhancement section, or somewhere in that section, that under 3.4, beginning in v2r1, you can put a Unix path name in the dsname level field. So we've seen that one already. And lastly, ZOS 1.10 added a dirlist service, which is a programming API where from Rex program or wherever the case may be, you can request the display of a directory list. And we'll see an example of that in just a minute. So starting off with the Unix directory list utility, what you get from 3.17. Type in a path name, and you see a standard Unix directory list like you see at the bottom of the screen here. So fairly straightforward, and that's been around for quite a while. The idea here was to begin to replace some of the functions that was available through iShell. So those of you who haven't used it, if you go under the ZOS user menu, 13, suboption 11 takes you to a Unix shell, and we call it iShell, which has some amount of Unix-related function. Over time, we're trying to migrate as much of that function as possible into 3.17. And we'll see more of that in the 2.2 discussion later on. One thing you can do under here is you can adjust the size of the columns and you can adjust the positions of the columns. So we're going to look at that across the next couple of charts. Clearly these are very feature-rich displays. First of all, on the left column, the file name, a Unix path name really is what we're talking about, can be very wide. So how wide do you want that to be? You want to be able to display most or all of the path name, but you'd also probably like some of the information you get in the columns without having to do lots of left and right commands. So you can click on the options at the top of the screen, choose 1 for directory list options, and that gives you a place where you can adjust the width of the file name column. So in this case, I have it set to 20 characters. You know, for longer path names, I'm probably getting some truncation there. But I've got a few columns on the screen, so if I set it much longer, I would begin to lose some of that. So it's a bit of a balance to strike. Also, I could choose option 2 from there, and that gives me a place where I can tailor the arrangement of my columns. So here are all the columns that you could have in your directory listing, and you'll see all these if you keep scrolling to the right. But maybe you would like to move the ones that you're most interested in over as close to the file name as possible. So in my example, I'm going to go down to where it says created and overtype the 13 with the 01 to move it to be my first column after the file name. In addition to moving the columns around, I can adjust the widths. So in this case, I'm going to change the width to be 10 characters, which will be just wide enough for the date, but won't show me the time. When I do that, I get the output you see here. So now created is my first column, and it's just the date, and maybe that's a more efficient use of my space in this case. Now, if I mess around in this panel long enough, I may decide that I don't really like what I've come up with. There's a very easy way to go back where you started from. There's a field you can select called Restore Default Column Arrangements. It'll take you back to the default layout. So that's just convenient if you start messing with this and decide you don't like what you've come up with. Another thing you can do is once you've got your columns in the positions that you would like, you can go up and go to the View menu, and the only option under there is Sort. So you can choose one for Sort, and it'll pull up a panel that allows you to select which column you want to sort on. And in this case, again, I've chosen created date time, which is option 16. And it's a little cut off of my screenshot, but below that is the field where you can also select where you want ascending or descending order. In my case, I have descending, and when you see the new output now, the created column has been sorted by date in descending order. Okay, so when I'm in 317 and I'm putting in a path name, I now have the ability as of 2.1 to use pattern matching characters as well. And you can do this in 3.17, but you can do it wherever you're putting in Unix path names now. And this may not be full regular expressions, but you do have the characters supported as you see on this screen. A question mark will match any single character, an asterisk match multiple characters, and the square brackets enclose a set of characters you want to match against. So you get something like you see at the top of this screen where I'm typing in a path name, and in this case I've said I want to go into the USR subdirectory. I want to find any next directory level that starts with either an I or an L. That's the I and L are in square brackets, followed by an asterisk. So anything starting with I or L will be matched there. And at the next level, I want a file name that begins with C, and then is followed by 7 characters, any 7 characters. So it's going to be an 8-character name starting with C, followed by a period, and then my extension is going to start with either C, D, or H, and anything after that. So I can do that, and I get results like you see in the bottom of the screen there, where I have everything starts with USR, and then I have either an I or L for the start of the next level, and then file names that start with C and 8 characters in end, as you see. So fairly powerful, and again, can be done anywhere where you can put a Unix path name in. From in the Unix directory list utility, you have a number of primary commands available. We've already talked about using sort. Obviously things like left and right, edit and find, and so forth. And you also have filter capabilities. So once you're in viewing a particular listing like we had on the previous chart, you can type filter and basically filter that down even further to say look for just a particular subdirectory or whatever. You have search for capabilities. We saw search for earlier. You can do similar type of processing within the Unix directory listing. And this next chart has a long list of line commands available. So out beside to the left of the file name, we have that command prefix field on these directory listings. And here's a fairly long list of line commands that you can type in that prefix area. And as you'll notice, they've definitely expanded over time. There were some added in 9, 10, 11, and 13. So you can choose to edit a file, browse a file. You can type L out beside a directory to drill down into the directory. You can delete a file. There's view, just generic view. There's view ASCII or edit ASCII, and so forth. You can look down through these. Notice the one over there that was added in 1.11 called Modify Format. We're going to take a look at that on the next chart, I believe. In 2.1, we added the ability to have an EU or a VU line command to edit Unicode or view Unicode. If you do the dataset info and look at the description of the file, one thing that's in there is the character set identifier. If the character set identifier tells us it's Unicode, then just doing an edit or a view, just typing E or V out by the file will do the right thing. We'll view it as Unicode or not. But if it's not tagged, and in the case of the example you see here, this is a file that hasn't been tagged, ISPF doesn't know the difference. So if you try to view it without the character set ID there, what you would see would be garbage. So if you instead type VU because you know it's Unicode, then we will actually do Unicode processing when we open the file. So that's all well and good. If now you realize that's the case and you want to tag this particular file, you can, in the command area, type MF or modify format, and that'll bring up a panel that you can then fill in the character set ID as well as some other format information. So again, a lot of things you can do with the various line commands. We talked about block commands earlier as they applied in the data set list. This pretty much looks like the exact same chart because it's the same idea, but only operating instead inside the Unix directory listing. So you can take line commands, Unix commands, TSO commands, clist, rex execs, all can be executed by prefixing with slashes and doing that at the beginning and the end of the block of files you want to execute it against. And here's a simple example. I want to delete a set of files, so I've typed //d, d being a line command for delete at the beginning and / at the end. And there it shows me that they have been deleted. So straightforward, and again, just very similar to what we saw with the data set list earlier. Okay, here's where I talked about how you can be pretty much anywhere in ISPF and go to the command line and get a Unix directory listing. So I'm on the Edit Entry panel, so option 2 from the ISPF primary menu. And at the top, I've decided to type udlist/etc, and it will immediately take me to a directory list for that particular directory. I mentioned a dirlist service that's available. So here's a little rex exec. And down in here, I set a variable to /bin, and I invoke the dirlist service and pass it that particular path name. When I run the exec, which you see me doing from the command line by issuing tso dirl, you see the Unix directory list get displayed down below that where it says /bin. It's showing me the listing of that directory just as requested from the exec. And probably the last thing we'll talk about in this section is the ability to run ZOS Unix commands in several different ways. First of all, when we're on the directory list panel, we can just type a ZOS Unix command at the top of the screen on the command line. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, you see me typing a netstat command, netstat-h, and it'll put me in a browser or a view where I can see the output of the command. Now, one catch on that is that there is an option under Unix directory list options, which you see as the left panel on this screen, that you have to select, which says enter your ZOS Unix commands in the command field. So you must set that option first to be able to enter the commands on the command field. And lastly, you can just type a / on the command field and it will take you to a Unix command shell. So I suspect that almost all of you have used option 6 off the ISPF primary menu that gets you a TSO command shell. If you've ever used that, then this will look very, very familiar. It's the exact same function, but for Unix commands instead of TSO commands. So here in the example, you see a / on the command line. That takes me to this screen. And again, this should look just like what you've seen before with the TSO command field, where I have a list of previously entered commands that I can choose to execute or retrieve, or whatever the case may be. If you've done this type of thing before with TSO command shell, the same functions are there. You have the ability to set whether you want clicking on one of the commands that are down in the list to retrieve it to the command line to actually execute it, or to delete it from your list. And you do that from the mode menu at the top of the screen. From the list menu at the top of the screen, you have the ability to turn update on or off, which means once you execute a command that you've typed on that command line, you want to update the list down there with it or not. So if you're building a list of favorite commands, you may at some point want to turn off the update mode so that you can keep the ones that you have there. So anyway, if you use TSO command shell, this should look quite familiar because it's a very similar function. Okay, and one last topic before we take a look at 2.2, it will be multiple screen support. Because ISPF allows up to 32 synchronously multitasking screens in one ISPF session, and there's a fair amount of function around that, and it continues to grow. You can use the split command, or with split new or just split. and do it that way. What I prefer to do is use the start command, which allows me to easily start a particular panel that I want to go to. So I'm in a data set list right now. I'd like to get a Unix directory listing. I can type start 3.17 and pull up the UD list. Once I have a bunch of screens up, then I can use the swap command to go back and forth. If you just have two, you're probably using your swap key, whatever that might be. In my case, it's PF9 to flip back and forth between them. As you start more and more screens and you have more and more panels up at the same time, managing them can get a little bit more complicated. You see what the swap command can do for you at the bottom of the screen here. You can just swap through the ring by saying swap next over and over again, swap previous. You can say swap in a number like swap 3 and it takes you to the third panel within your list of swap sessions and so forth. So that's really convenient once you have more than say 2 or 3. You can also type swap in list and it'll pull up a panel that shows a listing of all the screens you have open and allows you to select one from there. As you start getting a lot of screens, that is very useful. Probably all of you, if you're using multiple screen supports, already have your swap bar on. If you don't, you pretty much have to once you start getting very many to keep track of what you're doing. So you turn at the bottom of the screen, it shows the syntax swap bar on or off, or slash to customize it. It looks like what you see about a third of the way down the screen. There's an example where I've got the first field is the ISPF primary menu, the second one is the data set list, the third is a Unix directory list 3.17, and the fourth one is the TSO command prompt, option 6. So I have 4 panels open that I can now switch back and forth between using swap next. I can say swap 1, 2, 3, or 4 to jump straight to one of those and so forth. The other thing to point out on this chart is and you probably know this, but the meaning of the asterisk and the hyphen. So the asterisk in front of DS list tells you that my current panel, the active panel, is the data set list, the 3.4. And it tells me if I just hit my swap key, I'm going to be going to UD list. The hyphen tells me that. So the asterisk and hyphen tell me where I am and where I'm going to go with a simple swap. An area that was enhanced substantially in 2.1 was the ability to start a set of screens at ISPF invocation. So if that set of screens I had shown on the previous page of swap bar, if I want to get that same type of thing every time or almost every time, I can define a variable now, and in this example it's called myStart, and put a list of panels that I would like to start when ISPF comes up. So that when I start ISPF, I can just go straight into a configuration that I have just the panels I need. So if you look at that, it starts off with the keyword ISPF. That says I want a DS list, I want a UD list, I want a TSO command prompt. Pretty much the same thing you saw on the previous chart. And then the swap 1 at the end tells you, when it's all said and done, I want to switch back to the first position, which is the ISPF primary menu. So how do I get there? When I invoke ISPF and I specify the name of that variable that I created. So I created this variable using 7.3, and now whenever I come into ISPF, if I see ISPF myStart, I get started with just this set of panels open. Another enhancement in the same release was the ability to have a variable called zstart. It's just like the one before. You're defining a set of panels you want to associate with that variable name. The difference with zstart is if it exists and you come into ISPF just by saying ISPF or ISP start, we will load that initial set of panels, that initial command stack for you. You don't even have to specify the name of the variable. If zstart exists, we will use it. So you see on this display here, I've got that same set of screens I did before, 3.4, 3.17, the TSO command prompt. In this case I said swap 2. So swap 2 says that when ISPF starts, I'm going to swap immediately to the second screen in the order, which is 3.4, the DS list. So if I invoke ISPF with no further specification, zstart exists, and we'll go straight in, and you see what my initial view is. If you look at the swap bar at the bottom, you can tell I have the primary menu, I have DS list, which is the currently active one, Unix directory listing, and a TSO command prompt. So I'm ready to go. Now if I've done that, and I've got my zstart variable created with all those panels, if I come in one day and I want to get an ISPF and I don't want all those panels there, I just want the primary option menu only, I can start ISPF with the keyword basic, and it will bypass the zstart processing. And one last little enhancement in this space that also came around in 2.1 is the ability to do an equal X all. So you've got a whole bunch of panels open and you're ready to get out of ISPF. Instead of hitting PF3 n number of times to close down all the panels, you can say equal X all, and we will basically pass that equal X to each panel to have them all terminate and take you back to the TSO prompt. Now, that is dependent on every panel supporting equal X. A few occasionally don't, but most do, and so the equal X all typically will take you all the way out to TSO. So just as a convenience factor there. Okay, and the last section we're going to look at is V2R2 enhancements. So everything we've talked about before this chart has been available on at least 2.1, if not even further back, and I think most places I was careful to delineate which release it was associated with. So the stuff that we're going to talk about in the next few minutes is not available yet. It will be available when 2.2 GAs at the end of this coming September. So I have the usual disclaimer on this chart that says plans may change. We're just now getting into our beta program. So there could be some small tweaks to this. This is probably pretty close to what you'll see though. Okay, we're going to start in a very unexciting manner. The very first three things we're going to talk about are all removals from the product. Not exciting, but some things you should be aware of. 2.1 of ZOS was the last release to include HTTP server powered by Domino. IBM's recommendations is to switch to the HTTP server powered by Apache. Since our gateway APIs make use of the HTTP server, we've had samples associated with that as well as documentation. So this chart basically is saying that in 2.2 we're replacing our samples and documentation related to the HTTP server powered by Domino with the Apache version. So just a little cleanup there. 2.1 was the last release to include the Book Manager Build optional feature. This is 13.1 under your ISPF op menu, and that was, since it was removed from the product, we've removed it from that menu. There's an older TSO data utilities product that's been out of support for some period of time now. There were 6 commands related to that product that still existed in the ISPF TSO command table, and you see them on the screen here. We've removed those 6 commands. So again, this is just a form of cleanup. Okay, an enhancement here for people that use the dialog tag language compiler. Today, if you use that, when the compile completes, the return code just tells you that the compile job ran. You know that step completed, but you don't know if the actual compile was successful or not. 2.2 has an enhancement that passes back the return code through a variable, a shared pool variable called ISPF-RC, that allows you to query that from your batch job to know if your compile was successful or not. Okay, this next chart kind of falls into the category of a little bit of cleanup. We were talking just a few minutes ago about the provision of the multiple screen support in 2.1, in particular the start initial command stack and so forth. And we provided that, but there were a few weaknesses in the support that we were cleaning up in 2.2. For one thing, only uppercase values were supported for the command stack variable name. There was limited documentation for using the opt parameter. Most importantly, if you specified on ISP start any other operands like panel or whatever the case may be and didn't specify option, then opt zstart, which you kind of expected to be the default, was not really the default. You would not pick up your zstart command stack in that case. So 2.2 allows you now to say opt with any variable name in any case. You can say opt basic or you can say opt zstart, but the default will be zstart if opt is not specified, and that's whenever you use ISP start and any other operands. R13 provided support for user-defined line commands defined in ISPF command table, and we supported the idea of passing the command table to edit and view services, but we did not include support to pass the line command table to edif and vif, the edit interface service and view interface service. And so that has been cleaned up in 2.2, and you now can pass in the user line command table name to edif and vif. Another requirement that we had from customers was the ability to have more control over the left and right scroll commands passed through to dialogues. So you can use a command table to indicate that a command should be passed through to a dialog instead of being processed by ISPF, but the control of that pass-through operation was pretty much all or nothing. The customer requirement said we want the ability to control on a granular basis whether or not left and right scroll commands are passed through for dialog processing and bypassed ISPF processing of it. So think about cases like where you have help panels and your left and right is going to scroll back and forth, but some columns in that panel might be frozen. ISPF, if it's not an ISPF panel, we don't understand what the data format's like, so we don't know what should be scrolled and what shouldn't. So that's a case where you'd probably want to pass the left and right scroll commands through to your dialog to properly process the scroll operation against your own data. This next one could have been in the first half of this presentation because it's available on 2.1 and has been available on 2.1 for a while now, but officially speaking, it's a 2.2 item. And it's an item where you have the ability now to generate a keyword file from an existing ISPF configuration load module. So the scenario might be that you want to go in and tweak some keyword settings in the ISPF configuration utility, but you're not sure if your current keyword file is accurate. Maybe you've lost it, maybe you don't know if the one that you have is the one that your current load module is based on. This gives you a way now under option 7 in the ISPF configuration utility to point to an existing load module or use the load module that's currently in memory and sort of reverse engineer the keyword file, which then you'll be able to edit and build a new load module from. So this is, again, in 2.2, but it was also added via APAR to V2R1, and the APAR number is on your screen there, and that's been available for some time now. Here's a quick screenshot. It's just we're in the ISPF configuration utility, and you can choose option 7 there. You're going to put in a keyword dataset file. That's where we're going to store the new keywords. The next panel will ask you where you want the configuration load module to come from, and you can specify a configuration load module name, or you can just hit enter to have it operate against the in storage load module. Prior to 2.2, the number of records that you can browse was limited to 99,999,999, that number you see there. 2.2 increases the number of records that can be browsed to about a little over 2 billion. And the browse locate command is also can handle that same maximum line number. The browser interface service can also handle a larger number, assuming you pass a new parameter called extend and update your read routine to handle the larger value as well. Another item that is in 2.2 is an interactive ISPF gateway. Many of you may be familiar with the fact that ISPF has an ISPF gateway API. We'll call it the legacy gateway at this point, and that's existed for some time. If you have products today that use that API, or you have your own programs that use it, that's fine, it's still there. But we've introduced a second gateway that we're calling the interactive gateway, which is designed to support a more conversational type of interaction. So instead of being a case where your program sends in a one-shot thing, ISPF processes it and returns results and you're done, this is something where, for instance, you might send a command in to the gateway processes it, whatever happens from that causes a prompt to be generated. The gateway would return the prompt back to the caller. The caller could then figure out what it needs to do with the prompt, send that back to the gateway, and this type of back and forth interaction can go on as long as needed. So again, there's no updates to existing programs required unless you want to use the new gateway. The existing gateway is still there. If you do want to use the new gateway, there's an environment variable you have to configure, and there's additional details in ISPF planning and customization, and some in the appendix of this document that lists the new API request types and also show you an example of invoking the API. So we talked earlier about how you can pass a user line command table to edit and view services and through edif and vif in 2.2, but every time you want to invoke one of those services, you have to pass the command table if you want it to always be used. 2.2 goes a step further and provides a field in the configuration where you can set a global line command table that will be used by all services from there forward. So you go into editor settings and set this field, and now you no longer have to pass it through the various services. Another new setting that you might want to look at is the ability to globally disable the pack operation. Packing is a fairly old form of compression. It's not the most efficient in the world. Some of you may be using alternate forms of compression, so you would not necessarily want your users packing files. and you might want to be able to disable it so that they don't accidentally pack something during a copy operation or whatever the case may be. It's also true that the pack operation produces a format that really is only understood by ISPF. So if you are creating files that might be getting transferred off system to some other platform, they're really not going to know what to do with a packed file. So that's another reason you might want to disable this. So it's a simple keyword. If you set global disable pack, then from that point forward, the copy and move services will not allow you to pack. You will not be able to do an edit pack. If you edit an existing data set that is packed and you save it, we will unpack it at that point in time. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, this was also a customer requirement, which is the ability to display the record descriptor word in browse mode, because in doing so, the first 2 bytes of the RDW give you the length of the record for variable and B and VB data sets. And so that gives you a way to see the length of each field by the fact that you can see the RDW. So we enhance the browse display command in 2.2 to show the record descriptor word if you specify a given option. So here's the command display, and then the new option is on the end there, RDW. No RDW is obviously the default, but if you specify display RDW, you'll get an output that looks like this. We show everything in hex, and the first of each line now is the 4-byte record descriptor word. Notice for that second line in the display here, test line equal 1, that's, if you count, that's an 11-character long line. So if you look at the leftmost portion there, which is the RDW, you see 0 Fox. So that's a length of 15 characters. The 11 characters plus the 4-byte RDW gives you the 15. So that now gives you a way to see the length of each of these records. And what I believe is the last topic in here is Unix file system support in ISPF in 2.2. So as I said, we continue to take stuff that used to be available under iShell and move it into the Unix directory list utility under 3.17. And in 2.2 we moved the file systems menu over, and in doing so also enhanced the capability for displaying mounted file systems so that they were more usable for really large mounted file systems. So here's the file systems menu that's now under 3.17. Looks very similar to what was under iShell, but when I choose to view, in this case, a mount table by mount point, we get an output like we see at the bottom of the screen. And now we have a much more compact listing because some of it's been collapsed. And we can go down to any of those plus signs you see, click on those, and expand individual directories to drill down a little further. We also can type XA by any one of them and expand them that way, or we can type XA at the top of the screen and expand the entire view to see the full tree. And that gives you an example of expanding one of the directories. Just like we've seen in other places, we can also change the width of the mount point and file system columns, just like we could with the Unix path names. We talked about that a few minutes ago. We also can rearrange the columns and change the column widths, just as we explained a few minutes ago. So you now have that capability as well. And with that, there's an appendix session here that has a little bit more detail on the interactive gateway as I mentioned before. So if you're interested in that, be sure you pull the charts off SlideShare.